The clatter of gold dragging over bone. The year is 207-84 CE. You're pressed against a cold stone wall in a Roman street, crushed by thousands of bodies. There's no space to move, barely room to breathe. Your only task today is to watch. At the heart of the procession, a woman stumbles forward. Her wrists are raw and bleeding, not from ropes, but from gold. 40 pounds of solid golden chains coil around her arms, her neck, her ankles, so heavy that 2 Roman guards walk beside her, lifting the weight just enough to keep her from collapsing onto the cobblestones. That gold once belonged to her. 3 months ago, it paid for her armies, built her temples, made her the most feared woman between Egypt and Turkey. Now it's breaking her. Zenobia of Palmyra, the Queen of the East, the ruler who shamed 3 Roman emperors and commanded an empire of 70,000 soldiers, now shuffles through Rome like a prisoner on display. The crowd roars. Rotten fruit splatters against her chest. A glob of spit lands on her cheek, but she can't wipe it away. Her hands are pinned beneath the weight of her own stolen fortune. A child points and giggles. His mother hoists him higher so he doesn't miss a single moment. But here's what you can't see from where you stand inside Zenobia's mind. One thought pulses with every agonizing step. A prayer she's been whispering since before dawn. Not "save me," not "give me strength." Just 3 words, repeated like a rhythm. Let it be the villa, because she knows the 2 doors waiting at the end of this road. One opens to a gilded prison, where she'll spend her days as a Roman spectacle, alive but never free. The other leads to a black pit carved into the Capitoline Hill, where Rome buries its enemies in the dark and ensures nothing, no bone, no name, remains. 4 kilometers of not knowing which door bears her name. 4 kilometers of smiling Romans deciding whether she lives or dies. 4 kilometers of praying to gods who have never listened. This is what Rome did to captured queens. Not just Zenobia, not just once. This was a system, honed over 700 years, built to crush the most powerful women the ancient world ever knew. And Zenobia, she was one of the fortunate ones. The others faced fates that made execution seem like kindness. If this story holds you, leave a mark, a like, a share. It takes only a second, but it helps pull more voices from the silence. But before you can grasp what happened to the queens who weren't so lucky, you need to understand what a Roman triumph truly was. Forget the grand parades you've seen in films. The reality was far worse. When a Roman general won a decisive war, the Senate might grant him a triumph, the highest honor their society could bestow. A monstrous procession through the city's heart, celebrating his victory. But this wasn't just a parade. It was psychological butchery dressed as a festival. The march began at the Field of Mars, outside the city walls, snaking through the streets for nearly 4 kilometers before ending at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. The entire city halted. Over 1 million people lined the road. Shops bolted their doors. Courts adjourned. Even slaves were given the day off so they could watch other slaves being dragged in chains. Picture yourself as a captured queen watching this horror approach. First, you hear the music, trumpets and drums bouncing off the stone buildings, the sound rolling through the streets for nearly an hour before you see anything. Then come the carts, dozens of them, piled with treasure stolen from your kingdom, gold coins stamped with your ancestors' faces, silver plates your grandmother once ate from, sacred relics from temples your people built over centuries. The crowd cheers with each cart, already calculating how much their taxes will drop now that Rome owns your wealth. Next come the paintings, massive wooden panels carried by slaves, depicting your cities in flames, your soldiers slaughtered, your palace ransacked. Roman artists traveled with the legions for this very purpose, to capture the destruction in vivid detail. The crowd points and laughs. They recognize your homeland. They cheer when they see it burning. Then come the animals, exotic beasts from your land, lions in cages, elephants in chains, strange birds in golden cages, proof that Rome hasn't just conquered your people, it has claimed your very earth. And then, silence. The crowd hushes, the drums slow, because now come the prisoners. The common soldiers first, hundreds of them shackled together, heads bowed, knowing they're walking toward the slave markets. Their lives as free men are over, but the crowd barely glances at them. They're waiting for you. The captured rulers walk at the front of the prisoner column, still dressed in royal garments, still wearing crowns and jewelry. This is deliberate. A broken peasant means nothing, but a queen still clad in silk and gold, still recognizable as the ruler who defied Rome, now stumbling in chains, bleeding, exhausted, humiliated. That's the message Rome wants to scream across the ancient world. No crown protects you. No army saves you. No throne is beyond our reach. And here's what the movies never show: the uncertainty. Some captured rulers survived the triumph. They were exiled, imprisoned in comfort, even absorbed into Roman society. Others were executed the moment the parade ended, dragged into the Tullianum, an underground prison where they vanished while the celebrations raged above. You never knew which fate awaited you until you reached the end of that 4-kilometer walk. That uncertainty was part of the torture. For queens, the calculation was even more brutal. A dead queen became a forgotten name, a trophy tossed aside in a week. But a living queen, broken, humiliated, kept on display for years as a reminder of Roman power. That was far more valuable than any execution. Unless, of course, she was too dangerous to let live. The decision rested entirely with the emperor, and you wouldn't know his choice until a guard either handed you the keys to a villa or led you into the dark. In 60 CE, on a frozen island at the edge of the known world, a queen learned just how little her crown meant to Rome. Her name was Boudica, and her story is one of the most savage in Roman history. She was queen of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe in what is now eastern England. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had spent his entire reign trying to keep peace with Rome. He paid their taxes. He obeyed their laws. He even left half his kingdom to Emperor Nero in his will, a desperate attempt to protect his family after his death. The other half he left to his 2 daughters. It was a reasonable plan, a compromise that should have satisfied everyone. Rome ignored it completely. Within days of Prasutagus' death, imperial officials arrived with soldiers. They declared the entire kingdom now belonged to Rome. The will meant nothing. The alliance meant nothing. Decades of loyalty meant nothing. They began seizing everything. Iceni nobles were dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Estates that had belonged to families for generations were confiscated before sunrise. Relatives of the dead king were chained and marched into slavery while their children watched. Boudica protested. She was the queen. Her husband had been a Roman ally. There were treaties. There were laws. She demanded to speak with the procurator, a man named Catus Decianus. He agreed to meet her. What happened next was recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law served in Britain during this time. Tacitus doesn't soften the truth. He describes it with a blunt horror that suggests even Romans were sickened by what their officials did. Boudica was seized by soldiers in front of her own people. They humiliated her in the public square. The queen who had ruled beside her husband for decades, degraded before her subjects. They tied her to a post and flogged her. A Roman flogging wasn't a beating with a belt. They used a flagrum, a whip with multiple leather straps embedded with metal balls and shards of sheep bone. Each strike tore flesh from muscle. Each blow left wounds that would scar for life. Many victims died from the flogging alone. Boudica survived. But the whipping wasn't the worst part. Her daughters were brought forward. Tacitus doesn't give their ages. He doesn't name them. He only says they were unmarried. The soldiers grabbed them by the arms. They dragged them toward the soldiers' quarters, and Boudica, still tied to the post, still bleeding from the lashes, understood in that moment what was about to happen. She screamed not words, just sound. the raw, animal howl of a mother watching her children being taken. She pulled against the ropes until her wrists bled, tried to tear herself free, begged in a language the Romans didn't understand, and wouldn't have cared about even if they did. The soldiers laughed. Tacitus writes that the girls were handed over to the soldiers. He doesn't describe what came next. He didn't need to. Every Roman reading his account knew exactly what that phrase meant. And it was done deliberately, not in private, not in secret, but in front of the Iceni people, in front of their mother, still bleeding, still bound to the post, forced to watch because closing her eyes would have meant abandoning them. This was the message: your queen is nothing. Your princesses are nothing. Your entire tribe is nothing. Catus Decianus expected the Iceni to submit after this. He thought they'd be too terrified, too shattered to fight back. He was catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, Boudica raised an army, not just the Iceni. Word of what had happened to the royal family spread across Britain like wildfire. Tribes who had tolerated Roman rule for decades suddenly saw their own daughters in those princesses, their own wives in that flogged queen. They came by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Boudica led them first to Camulodunum, the Roman capital of Britain. The city had no walls. The veterans who lived there had grown soft, complacent, convinced their conquered subjects would never dare rebel. The Iceni burned it to the ground. They left no one untouched: men, women, children, slaves, anyone tied to Rome. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't offer surrender. This wasn't conquest. This was vengeance. Next was Londinium, the largest trading city in Britain. The Romans tried to evacuate, but thousands were left behind. Boudica's army showed no mercy. Archaeologists have found a layer of charred debris across London dating to this exact period, a red scar of destruction marking how thoroughly the city was razed. Tacitus claims the final death toll was 70,000 Romans and their allies. Other sources say it was even higher. And through it all, Boudica led from the front, riding a chariot, her daughters beside her, the same daughters who had been wronged in the public square, now watching Roman cities burn. Tacitus preserved a speech he attributed to her before the final battle. Standing before her army, she declared she wasn't fighting as a queen for her kingdom. She was fighting as a mother, avenging what had been done to her daughters. The last battle came at a place never identified. Roman discipline and tactics overcame Boudica's larger but less organized forces. The rebellion was crushed. Rather than be captured, Boudica took poison. She knew what Rome did to captured queens. She had already tasted it. Her daughters disappear from history after the initial assault. Their names were never recorded. Their fates are unknown. Maybe they died in battle. Maybe they drank poison beside their mother. Maybe they were captured and suffered the very fate Boudica had fought to avenge. We'll never know. Rome made sure of that. 40 years before Boudica painted Britain red with Roman blood, another queen learned that sometimes survival is its own kind of torture. Her name was Thusnelda, and her story might be the cruelest of all, not for what was done to her body, but for what was done to her bloodline. She was the wife of Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who delivered Rome its most humiliating military defeat in history. You might not know his name, but you know what he did. In 9 CE, Arminius ambushed 3 entire Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. 15,000 soldiers marched into that forest. Almost none marched out. 3 days of slaughter in the rain and mud. Legion eagles, the sacred standards that symbolized Rome itself, were captured by barbarians. The commander, Varus, took his own life rather than be taken alive. When news reached Emperor Augustus, the most powerful man in the world, he reportedly wandered his palace for months afterward, banging his head against the walls, screaming into the darkness, "Quintili Varus, give me back my legions!" Rome never forgot that defeat. They never forgave it. And when they couldn't capture Arminius himself, they went after everyone he loved. Thusnelda was betrayed by her own father. His name was Segestes, a Germanic chief who had opposed his daughter's marriage to Arminius from the beginning. He had always sided with Rome, always believed cooperation was better than resistance. When Roman forces returned to Germania seeking revenge, Segestes saw a chance to prove his loyalty. He kidnapped his own pregnant daughter and handed her over to the legions. Let that sink in. Her own father, while she carried his grandchild, he traded his daughter and his unborn grandchild for Roman favor, for political advantage, for a pat on the head from the empire that wanted to destroy everything his people had built. The Romans were thrilled. They couldn't have Arminius, but they had the next best thing, his wife and his unborn heir. They kept Thusnelda imprisoned but alive. They let her give birth in captivity, a son named Thamelicus, the heir to Arminius, the prince of the Cherusci, the grandson of Rome's greatest military humiliation. They waited until 17 CE, when the general Germanicus had enough victories in Germania to claim a triumph, and that's when they paraded Thusnelda through Rome. Imagine this, a Germanic queen, the proud wife of the man who made Augustus weep, walking in chains through streets packed with Romans who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons in that forest. Her infant son clutched in her arms. The crowd didn't just jeer. They howled for blood. They screamed for the baby to be killed right there in the street. Mothers pointed at the child and told their own children, "That's the spawn of the monster who killed your uncle, your father, your grandfather." A child in the crowd hurled a stone. It struck Thusnelda's shoulder, then another, then another. Roman soldiers had to form a barrier around her, not to protect her, but to ensure she survived long enough to finish the procession. The Roman writer Strabo described Thusnelda's face during the triumph. He expected her to weep, to beg, to collapse like so many prisoners before her. She didn't. She walked with her gaze fixed forward, her expression unreadable. No fear, no tears, no satisfaction given to the mob that wanted to see her broken. But here's what Strabo couldn't see: the promise Thusnelda was making. Not to the gods, not to her husband still fighting in the forests of Germania, but to the infant boy pressed against her chest. She whispered it in the Germanic tongue, so quietly no one heard. In words the Romans couldn't understand: "They will not break you. Whatever they do, wherever they take you, you are the son of Arminius. You carry his blood." And one day, she never finished the promise, because she already knew she couldn't keep it. She held her son against her and walked 4 kilometers through pure hatred. But her defiance couldn't save him. Thamelicus was raised as a Roman slave, the heir to Germania's greatest hero. The prince who should have led his people against Rome was instead trained as a gladiator. Think about what that means. Romans went to the arena to watch prisoners fight for entertainment. They ate figs and drank wine while men bled on the sand. They cheered when a body fell, when victory was declared. And somewhere in that arena, fighting for their amusement, was the son of the man who had destroyed 3 legions. The emperors knew exactly who he was. Every time they watched him fight, they were watching the son of their greatest enemy struggle to survive. Every wound he took was revenge for Teutoburg. Every time he won, it proved Rome had broken the bloodline of Arminius. Most Romans in the crowd had no idea. They just saw another barbarian with a sword, trying to live another day. But that was the point. The prince of the Cherusci reduced to anonymous entertainment, his royal blood meaning nothing, his father's legacy erased with every fight. Did Thamelicus know who he was? Did anyone ever tell him that his father was a hero, that his mother had been a queen, that he was meant to lead armies, not die for applause? Or did he grow up believing he was nothing, just another slave, just another body for the arena? We'll never know, because Rome made sure no one recorded his story. The sources say he died at Ravenna, lost in the arena, the last of Arminius' bloodline, his life ending on the sand while Romans cheered and ate their lunch. No one recorded his final opponent, No one remembered his last words. He was just another fallen gladiator, another corpse dragged away, while the crowd waited for the next fight. And that was exactly what Rome wanted. Thus Nelda herself vanishes from history after the triumph. No record of her death, no mention of her fate. She likely spent her remaining years as a household slave somewhere in Italy, scrubbing floors, serving food, taking orders from people who weren't fit to carry her sandals when she was queen. Did she ever learn what happened to her son? Did she hear rumors from other slaves? Did she die hoping he was still alive somewhere, still fighting? Or did she die knowing the promise she'd whispered during the triumph, that they wouldn't break him, had been shattered before he could even remember her face? The woman who had stood beside the greatest Germanic hero of all time, reduced to property, her husband dead, her son lost in the arena, her father living comfortably as a Roman collaborator, rewarded for his betrayal. That was Roman mercy, not death, not even public torture, just a slow, grinding erasure of everything you ever were. Now you understand what Zenobia was thinking during those 4 kilometers. She knew about Boudica. Every queen in the ancient world knew about Boudica. The story was passed down as a warning. This is what happens when Rome decides to make an example of you. She knew about Thusnelda, about the son raised as a gladiator, about the slow destruction of an entire bloodline. So when Zenobia felt those golden chains cutting into her wrists, she wasn't just enduring physical pain. She was calculating off, would Aurelian execute her? Would he hand her over to his soldiers like Boudica? Would he keep her alive as a trophy, watching her children be absorbed into the empire that destroyed her? 4 kilometers of those thoughts. A million Romans screaming for her blood. And at the end, she got the door that didn't lead to the execution chamber. Emperor Aurelian made his own calculation. Zenobia was too famous to simply kill. For 5 years, she had ruled an empire stretching across the Roman East. She had minted coins with her face, declared herself Queen of Egypt, styled herself as the new Cleopatra. Executing her would have made her a martyr, a symbol of resistance, a name rebels would invoke for centuries. But keeping her alive, visible, dependent on Rome for everything, that sent a better message. Look at Zenobia. Look at the Queen of the East. She challenged us, and now she lives at our pleasure, eating our food, following our laws, grateful just to be alive. Aurelian gave her a villa in Tibur, about 30 kilometers from Rome, a comfortable prison, a gilded cage. The Historia Augusta tells us what happened next. Zenobia married a Roman senator. The warrior queen who had humiliated 3 emperors became a Roman housewife. She attended dinner parties where guests whispered about her past. She walked through markets where people pointed and stared. She raised daughters who would never know the empire their mother had built, daughters who learned Latin instead of Aramaic, who worshipped Roman gods instead of the gods of Palmyra. Her daughters married into noble families. They raised children who would grow up thinking of themselves as Roman. Within 3 generations, the bloodline of the Queen of the East had been completely absorbed. No one would remember they carried the blood of a woman who once controlled more territory than most Roman emperors. That was the genius of Rome. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they erased them, absorbed them, turned conquered bloodlines into Roman citizens who celebrated the empire that destroyed their ancestors. Boudica chose death rather than live as Rome's trophy. Her rebellion killed 70,000 Romans, but it ultimately failed, and her daughters vanished from history. Thusnelda watched her son become a gladiator, watched him die for Roman entertainment, spent her remaining years as a slave. Zenobia survived. She had comfort. She had status. But every day for the rest of her life, she woke up knowing she existed because Rome allowed her to exist. Every meal she ate, every bed she slept in, every conversation she had, all of it was a gift from the empire that destroyed everything she built. Was that mercy? Or was it the most sophisticated torture of all? The Mamertine prison still stands in Rome today. You can visit it, take photographs, post them online. Tourists stand in the same chamber where Rome ended its enemies in the dark while celebrations raged above. The streets where Zenobia walked in golden chains are now shopping districts. People sip espresso in the same forum where crowds once cheered for captured queens to be destroyed. We've sanitized this history, turned suffering into scenery, just like the Romans did. Zenobia survived those chains. She lived out her days in a Roman villa, comfortable, watched, dependent. But her servants said she woke shaking from nightmares. That her eyes sometimes drifted mid-conversation, lost in memories she never spoke aloud. That she prayed alone in a language Rome could never erase. She never returned to Palmyra, never saw her throne again. When she died, she was buried in Roman soil under a Roman name, the Queen of the East, nearly erased, but not entirely. Boudica's story survived. Thusnelda's story survived. Rome wanted them forgotten. 2,000 years later, someone is still telling their tales. They were meant to be silenced, but silence is not erasure, and forgotten is not gone. If this reached you, stay with us. We dig into the chapters history tried to bury, the voices that were meant to stay silent forever, because the past isn't dead. It's waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to listen.